The air in the Tower of London was so thick with tension that even the guards, hardened to violence, avoided holding her gaze. On that May day in 1536, the whole place seemed soaked in the sense of the inevitable. Every stone of the fortress remembered victories and betrayals, but today they were only scenery for an event that would send a chill through people's veins for years to come. On the raised platform in the middle of the courtyard stood a woman whose name had until recently been spoken with reverence. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was no longer a symbol of a triumphant new dynasty. She had become a warning. The most dazzling power can turn into a trap. But the real drama didn't begin the moment the executioner's sword rose, nor simply because the king's wife stood on that scaffold. Far worse was happening behind the scenes, out of the crowd's sight. A delicate, meticulously built system of intimidation, humiliation, and psychological pressure had been set in motion long before that morning. People liked to tell themselves Anne was executed because the king had grown tired of his wife. The truth ran much deeper. It was a rehearsed demonstration that Henry VIII's will stood above law, above morality, above even the idea of justice. For those who watched that day, she became the first English queen to wear a crown and die on the scaffold. For her daughter, Elizabeth, still a child, it was a far more terrifying message. A world where even the closest can turn away, where betrayal becomes the official sentence, and where truth no longer matters. That sense, born on the ground before the White Tower, would shape Elizabeth's character for decades. In those moments, the crowd hungrily watched her every movement. But beneath the noise there was another kind of silence, the silence of an inner catastrophe that didn't last a second, but 17 days. 17 days of systematic destruction of human dignity, disguised as justice. Events moved so fast and were so carefully staged that Anne barely had a chance to register how swiftly her world was falling apart. And this is where the real story begins, not with the blow of a sword, but with the moment the queen still sat in her box at a courtly tournament, unaware that a simple wave of her hand would become her sentence. It began almost unnoticed. On May 2nd, 1536, a tournament was held at Greenwich Palace. Loud, splendid, exactly what a royal court required. Anne sat in the Queen's box, surrounded by ladies and knights, the very picture of dignity and power. She leaned forward and dropped a handkerchief, a routine sign of favor to a competitor. In earlier times, the gesture would have earned smiles and a few jealous looks at court, but that innocent signal became the spark that lit the fire that day. Henry VIII, seated nearby, saw her movement. His face changed instantly. He said nothing, made no public reproach. He simply rose and walked out of the tournament in silence. That was enough for everyone to feel the clouds gathering over the Queen. Within 24 hours, Anne was arrested. No reasons were explained. The charges named infidelity, treason, even incest with her own brother. The accusations were so absurd, many at court could hardly believe them. But that was the horror. The case required no proof.
It would later come out that Henry had signed her death warrant even before the charges were read. Everything else was a performance, carefully staged so no one would doubt the king's right to decide anyone's fate, even the Queen's. Anne did not know this as she was taken from Greenwich. She still hoped for a fair trial, still believed that her marriage to Henry and the birth of their daughter would shield her from slander. But the decision had already been made. News of the arrest spread instantly. Panic seized the palace. Those who had sought her smile and favor only yesterday hurried to step aside, unwilling to be dragged into the scandal rushing toward them. A vacuum opened around Anne. She stopped being queen and became an outcast, a person the state had decided to erase. What happened at the tournament was later called by many at court a performance staged by Henry himself. Was his sudden anger genuine over the handkerchief, or was it arranged in advance? Either way, from that day, Anne's life began a countdown that would end on the scaffold. Even then, she did not know how dreadful the days ahead would be. When Anne was taken from Greenwich, the man who could turn rumor into verdict took charge: Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Cromwell had long understood that the queen had become inconvenient. Anne was a problem not only because of her influence and temperament, but because Henry sought a new marriage. The case had to be built so no one could doubt the need to destroy the queen. Cromwell did not try subtlety. He leveled the most shocking charges he could imagine. Anne was accused of violating every sacred law. Allegedly, she had relations with 5 men, including her brother George Boleyn. The accusations were so incredible, many in court only shook their heads. But in Cromwell's logic, it was simple. The worse the charge, the less chance the accused had to be believed. The chief witness was the musician Mark Smeaton. He was tortured on the rack until he confessed to having had relations with the queen. His words became the foundation of the whole case. The other accused, even when facing their own deaths, denied everything. Their voices meant nothing. Particular attention was paid to the details woven into the indictment. Specific days were listed when Anne supposedly met her lovers. But comparing those dates with royal records made it clear. On those days, she was elsewhere. One striking example: she was accused of infidelity in Greenwich, while records show she was in Richmond, more than 10 miles away. Was this an error? No. Cromwell understood that truth did not matter. Only the form of an accusation and the impression it made on the crowd and the judges mattered. Even those who despised Anne could not hide their doubts. The imperial ambassador, one of her fiercest enemies, admitted in his reports that the evidence was built on assumptions and rumors. But that did not stop the machinery of accusation. Cromwell himself boasted that his task was not to investigate, but to bring the process to an end. And that end was already decided. For Anne, it was like falling into a void. She could see the game being played against her, a game where truth had no place. Every attempt to defend herself only fed the wheel of accusation. Everything around her turned into a theater, and she was forced into the role of the guilty long before realizing that all her lines had already been written.
When the gates of the tower closed behind her, Anne still imagined she would be placed in a dark, damp cell like any other prisoner. Instead, she was given a far more cruel stage. She was housed in the very same chambers where she had stayed 3 years earlier, on the night before her coronation. The same walls, the same tapestries, the same windows looking out over the river where crowds had once cheered their new queen. Now it was an instrument of psychological torture. Every detail reminded her of how high she had risen and how far she was about to fall. Those rooms became a trap, where every object spoke of lost power. Anne even asked the constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, "Will they send me to the dungeons?" He replied, "No, madam, you will be placed where you were on the day of your coronation." At that, she broke into sudden, harsh laughter. Not laughter of joy, but a cracked, nervous sound that Kingston later described as madness born of unbearable pressure. The performance was only beginning. 4 ladies were assigned to her, ostensibly as companions, but in truth, each was a spy. Among them was Kingston's own wife. These women were ordered to watch her every step, her every word, even her dreams.
Whatever Anne said was carried in letters straight to Henry. She had no right to a thought, a prayer, not even a whispered word without it being recorded and used against her. Days and nights blurred into endless waiting. Sometimes she wandered the chambers, absent-mindedly touching familiar fabrics. Sometimes she collapsed into tears. Sometimes she laughed as if the world around her had lost its shape. In desperation, she even begged for a medical examination to prove her innocence, as if her body could speak where her words failed. But the true torture was not darkness or chains, it was memory itself. The luxury around her became a mirror of her fall, reminding her of glory turned into doom. Every day ate away at her mind, stripping her of the last fragments of strength. Inside the tower, time lost its ordinary rhythm. It became a weapon. At first, she was told her end would come on May 18th. She prepared for that day, prayed, silently said farewell to her daughter, and tried to steady her soul. She spent the night in tears and tension, convinced that dawn would bring her last moments. But when morning came, nothing happened. No guards arrived, no summons to the courtyard. The execution had been postponed. Thus began the cruelest form of torment, waiting for death that is always delayed. At first, she thought it a mistake, or perhaps mercy. Soon she realized it was deliberate. She was being forced to relive her own ending again and again. Each evening felt like the last, each morning an extension of the sentence. Rumors reached her in fragments. She heard guards' footsteps, felt the stares of the women spying on her, tried to coax scraps of truth from them, but received only silence or hints. No one would say when her end would come. The uncertainty was the very point, designed to erode her will. Kingston wrote that Anne often expressed her wish that it might all be over quickly. She was exhausted by the endless waiting, by being prepared for death only to have even that moment snatched away. The vibrant, spirited woman of the court now literally begged for an end. To her captors, it was proof. The system had broken her spirit.
Yet the deepest wound was not the waiting, but her complete isolation. Anne constantly asked after her brother George, hoping he might still be spared. She spoke of her father, refusing to believe he had abandoned her. But the truth was harsher. George was in another part of the tower, awaiting his own death. Her father, to save himself, pretended he had no daughter. There was no one left to stand by her. Those who once called her their future now stayed silent. Even family would not intervene. Anne understood she was utterly alone, surrounded only by those who anticipated her fall. That realization was more devastating than any official charge. When Anne was finally led to trial, she still held her head high. She knew the day would decide her fate, yet clung to the hope that truth might somehow pierce through lies. What she faced instead was not a trial, but a staged performance. 27 peers of England sat in judgment. Among them was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided and would pronounce the verdict. For Anne, this was a cruel blow, her own blood publicly declaring her guilt. Beside him sat Charles Brandon, her long-standing enemy who had never hidden his hatred. There too was Piercy, the man who had once shared with her dreams of marriage, but had been forced to renounce her for the king's sake. Even that past was turned into a weapon, placing him among her judges. And there were also relatives of Jane Seymour, the woman who would soon take her place beside the throne. Anne had no defender, no witnesses.
She was not even allowed to see the charges in advance. Everything presented was hearsay, confessions forced by torture, and rumors collected by Cromwell. No evidence, no living testimony, only papers and hostile faces in the seats of judgment. She spoke in her own defense with a clear voice and a dignity that astonished even those who had come to watch her fall. She denied everything firmly, reminding them she was not just a woman, but their queen. But it was futile. When Norfolk asked for the verdict, all 27 peers uttered the same word, guilty. Not a single doubt, not one voice for acquittal. It was a play in which every role had already been assigned. Henry had told Jane Seymour in advance that Anne would be condemned that very day. Her fate was sealed long before she walked into the courtroom. The trial merely confirmed what had already been decided in the palace. And in that moment, Anne grasped the truth. No one here was searching for justice. Her presence was required only to lend legitimacy to a script already written. A court that accused her of impossibilities without even trying to disguise it became the final proof that truth no longer held any weight. After the verdict, there remained one last question: how the sentence would be carried out. By law, treason and adultery against the king's wife were punishable by burning. That was the fate Anne expected and prepared for. But Henry chose to show what he called mercy. He commuted her sentence to death by the sword.
On the surface, it seemed an act of compassion. A swift stroke of the blade was considered easier than fire. But in reality, it was yet another move in the psychological game. Instead of an English executioner with his axe, Henry ordered a swordsman from France. That meant waiting, and waiting meant more torment. She was forced once again to endure days of uncertainty, knowing the end was near, but not when it would fall. Even the choice of a Frenchman was loaded with symbolism. In England, death sentences were carried out with the axe, a familiar sight to the people. But Henry made sure his queen's fate would be delivered by a foreign hand. It was a public humiliation, a signal that she was so alien, so rejected, that even her death lay outside English tradition. Rumors of this decision spread quickly through court and country. People whispered, if the king brought in a foreign executioner, this was no ordinary sentence. It was a display of power. Every detail became a message. The swordsman was not simply to take her life, he was to sever her from England itself. For Anne, this was another cruel blow. She realized she had been denied even the fate of an Englishwoman. She faced new days of waiting, picturing the face of a man summoned from afar solely to end her story. That anticipation broke her far more than the thought of death itself. The executioner from Calais was paid £23 for his service, a fortune at the time. But for Henry, the cost was nothing. The entire spectacle had been carefully staged. Even the last detail was arranged to prove that the king's will stood higher than law, tradition, or anything else. When the morning of May 19th arrived, silence hung over the tower as though the fortress itself held its breath. For Anne, it was the day she had both dreaded and awaited. All the previous postponements had worn her down, but now she appeared calmer than anyone expected. She walked out in a gray gown trimmed with fur, her hair tucked beneath a plain cap. Gone was the dazzling woman of court. In her place stood a figure already half beyond this world. Witnesses wrote that she seemed almost transparent. Her face was pale but strikingly composed, as if the storm within had burned out, leaving only clarity. When she mounted the scaffold, she looked over the crowd and spoke. Her words are preserved in chronicles. She asked them to pray for the king and called him a gracious and merciful sovereign. To some it sounded like bitter irony, to others like a desperate attempt to safeguard her daughter's future. Either way, these were not words of truth, but of a woman who understood her voice now mattered only as a final impression. When she said, "I hear the executioner is skilled, and I have but a little neck," with that she clasped her throat in her hands and laughed. It was not joyous laughter. It rang like the echo of madness, a sign that she had been driven to the edge, where even death itself became a grim jest. No one in the square had expected such words.
The French swordsman behaved unlike the English axeman. He did not display his weapon beforehand. His blade lay hidden under straw. While Anne prayed, he distracted her with a sudden shout to his assistant. She turned her head, and in that instant, a single stroke ended everything. Witnesses swore her lips kept moving for several moments afterward, as if still whispering a prayer. No one knows whether it was lingering life or only muscle spasms, but that image, a queen whose mouth still prayed after her body was divided from her head, carved itself forever into the memory of her age. For those who saw it, the scene was not merely the end of a trial. It was a spectacle designed to humiliate and erase, to prove that the monarch's will could destroy even one who had worn a crown. That was the true meaning of the day. As the crowd dispersed, it seemed Anne's story was finished, but her final indignity was still to come. For a woman who had worn the crown of England, no coffin had been prepared. No one had arranged a burial. When her ladies, weeping uncontrollably, bent over the body, they realized there was nothing to lay it in. They searched the tower's armories and found an old arrow chest, rough dark wood, and that became her last resting place. Her body and head were wrapped in white cloth, as though hastily veiling the splendor that had so recently shone in her features. There were no chants, no sacred words, none of the rites that usually accompanied the passing of great figures. It was as if they rushed to erase even the fact of her existence. Carried through the courtyard, every step echoed with heavy silence. The tears of a few loyal souls mingled with the indifference of the rest. Her grave was dug in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower itself, among others who had met the same fate. But Anne was given no sarcophagus, no monument. She was lowered into the earth unmarked, as if meant to be forgotten. Thus, the woman who had been crowned in Westminster Abbey was laid to rest in an anonymous grave. For Anne's attendants, it was the final torment. They knew they were witnessing not just the destruction of a body, but the erasure of a memory. The queen who had once been hailed as the new hope of the dynasty was vanishing as if without a trace. Yet history does not stay silent. Even the absence of a stone over her remains became a symbol, proof of how easily power can attempt to strike a person's name from collective memory. To contemporaries, the contrast was staggering. Only yesterday, her name rang in hymns, her face appeared on medals, her coat of arms decorated palaces, and now her body lay in an old weapons chest, as if discarded. That was the cruelest irony. The greatness the king himself had built was destroyed by his own hand, and destroyed so completely that every reminder was meant to be wiped away. But it could not be erased entirely.
When Anne disappeared into her unmarked grave, her daughter was just 2 years old. Elizabeth was far too young to understand what had happened, but her world was altered forever. The princess suddenly became a child without status, without a mother, and without a future, declared illegitimate. Children forget many things, but what burns deepest never fades. By the time she was 8, Elizabeth already understood the price of her mother's execution. She was forced to witness a haunting repetition. Her young stepmother, Catherine Howard, walked the same path across the same grass to the same scaffold in the Tower courtyard. That day, Elizabeth spoke words that would define her life. "I will never marry." To adults, it sounded like a child's whim, but it was in truth a solemn vow. She had seen that marriage to a king did not bring a crown of joy, but the shadow of the block. Elizabeth lived under that shadow for the rest of her life.
She could not honor her mother publicly. Anne remained officially branded a traitor. But in private, Elizabeth guarded her memory. She owned a ring with a hidden clasp that revealed two tiny portraits inside, one of herself, the other of her mother. Two faces, turned toward each other, kept secret from every eye but her own. When the ring was removed after Elizabeth's death, courtiers saw for the first time the secret she had carried on her hand for decades. She kept other relics as well. In her libraries remained books that had once belonged to Anne. In her chambers, the emblem of a falcon, her mother's personal badge, could sometimes be glimpsed. These were not just mementos, but talismans of identity. Most of all, her mother's fate shaped Elizabeth's own view of punishment. Unlike her father, who signed death warrants without hesitation, Elizabeth delayed each time. When Parliament demanded the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth held back for weeks, unable to put her name to it. When she finally signed, she later claimed she had been deceived, her consent forced. Historians may see this as political maneuvering, but at its core, it was something else: the unhealed memory of a mother she could never forget. She knew a single stroke of the pen could destroy not only a life, but a reputation. And so, every time papers were brought before her with the names of the condemned, Elizabeth saw again the image of a woman on the scaffold, lips still moving in prayer even after the crowd had turned away. After Anne's trial and execution, all of England understood one thing: the law was no longer a shield. What happened to the Queen proved that anyone could be declared guilty if the monarch willed it. From that moment, truth carried no weight, and the courts became no more than stage sets. The precedent was too stark to be forgotten. 6 years later, the same scene replayed on the same ground at the Tower. Young Catherine Howard, Anne's cousin, met the same fate. The charges were just as fragile, the trial just as swift, the end just as certain. The crowd gathered at the scaffold already knew the script: arrest, tower, trial, accusations, death. Only the names changed.
Gradually, execution stopped being an exception and became a polished mechanism of intimidation. First, it was used against the king's rivals, then against discontented nobles, and always the memory of Anne rose again. Her story, the model of how a judicial killing could be turned into a display of absolute power. Nor was England alone in noticing the shift. Across Europe, people whispered that Henry VIII had set a new standard, the standard of arbitrariness. Where once at least a veil of evidence had been offered, now it was clear: the king's desire was enough. The thought unsettled even those who had never liked Anne. For ordinary Englishmen, it carried a different meaning. They saw, if a queen could be stripped of everything, title, honor, even the dignity of a grave, then no one was safe. In taverns and markets, people whispered the same phrase: anyone can be broken. Fear seeped deeper into society than ever before. Thus, Anne's tragedy was more than a personal story. It reshaped the very idea of justice. Where once people believed in the law's protection, now they believed only in the king's whim. And that shadow, cast by her trial, stretched over England for decades to come. News of Anne Boleyn's fall spread far beyond England. In Paris and Madrid, people whispered, if the king could strip his own wife of crown and honor, then no alliance with him was secure. The French reacted with particular intensity. The secretary of their ambassador, Lancelot de Carlos, composed a long poem about the entire process within 2 weeks. His verses raced through Europe's salons faster than official reports. Henry was so enraged by the response that he ordered his envoy in Paris to suppress the story. But it was too late. Europe now saw him not as a reformer, but as an unpredictable tyrant. Even the Spanish diplomat Eustace Chapuis, who had hated Anne for years, admitted in a letter to Emperor Charles V that the case was built on suspicions and hints. For a man who had long considered her an enemy, such words were an acknowledgment. The world understood this was not justice, but a public act of terror. England's reputation was deeply damaged. States that had once courted alliance now feared Henry's instability, and the image of the executed queen became a European symbol of how fragile a woman's power could be in a world where laws bent to the will of one man. From accusation to execution, only 17 days had passed. For England, it was a shock. A queen, recently crowned, destroyed faster than a common criminal. The speed was no accident, but part of the design. The less time for defense or doubt, the more certain the outcome. Even contemporaries realized this was not a trial, but a lightning-fast purge. Anne was gone, but her shadow lay over her daughter's life. Out of that horror was born a future ruler, Elizabeth. It was her memory of her mother that made her cautious, resolute, and able to survive in a world ruled by men. Henry had wanted to erase Anne, but instead he created a queen who outshined his glory and reigned longer than he ever dreamed. Today, tourists walk the same corridors where Anne waited for the end. On the green where the scaffold once stood, there is now a glass monument. But the truest memorial is not in stone. It lies in the knowledge that when power replaces law, no one is safe. Anne's story is not only that of a single queen. It is a warning for every age. When truth yields to force, justice dies as silently as she did in the Tower Yard.